My name is Corinne Ashby. I'm 30 years old. The morning of my final Harvard admissions interview, my parents canceled my flight without telling me and booked my sister a spa day instead. I stood there frozen, boarding pass in hand. My mother didn't even look up from her magazine and said coldly, "Stop being so dramatic, Corinne. It's just an interview." My father added, "Your sister needs this. Don't ruin it for her." I made that flight anyway. 6 hours later, I sat across from the admissions director. He looked at my wrinkled blazer, then at my last name, and his expression changed completely. He reached into a folder, pulled out a page, and said with disbelief, "Wait, you're her?" What my family tried so hard to bury was about to be the very thing that destroyed everything they'd built. If you've ever been the daughter your family decided to make smaller, this story is for you. Like the video, subscribe for the rest, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I need you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened that morning, because from the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. We lived in Brentwood, a leafy, manicured suburb outside Nashville, Tennessee. My father, Walter Ashby, was a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm downtown. My mother, Denise, didn't work not because she couldn't, but because she'd built an entire identity around being the woman who managed the household, the calendar, the image. 2 daughters, a colonial with white shutters, a minivan that got traded in for a luxury SUV the year I turned 16. On paper we had it all. But inside that house there was a hierarchy, and I learned my place in it long before I understood the words to describe it. My sister Paisley was 2 years younger than me, but from the moment she could talk she occupied a different category in our household entirely. She was the pretty one, the charming one, the one adults leaned down to compliment before they'd even finish saying hello to me. She had a way of tilting her head and smiling that made grown men at church potlucks melt, and my mother built an entire mythology around that smile, as if it were a talent instead of a genetic accident. I was the serious one. That was my label, delivered with a faint note of apology, as though seriousness were a consolation prize handed to the daughter who hadn't inherited the good stuff. I read constantly. I kept a color-coded planner from the time I was in 7th grade. I brought home report cards with rows of A's that my father would glance at for exactly 2 seconds before asking whether Paisley had turned in her science project yet. It started small, the way these things always do in families that pride themselves on never raising their voices. "Can you help Paisley with her homework? She learns better from you than from us. Can you drive her to cheer practice? I have a hair appointment. Can you cover for her when she skips curfew? Don't tell your father, it'll just cause a fight." By the time I was 16, I was functioning less like her sister and more like an unpaid, unappointed guardian, managing a life that wasn't mine while mine sat quietly on hold. I threw myself into school because it was the one arena where the scales weren't rigged against me from birth. I took every AP class my school offered. I co-founded the debate team my junior year and argued my way to a state semifinal. I spent my summers doing unpaid research work for a professor at Vanderbilt because I'd read that Ivy League admissions committees valued genuine intellectual engagement over resume padding. I didn't do any of it because I expected my parents to notice. I did it because it was the only thing in that house that belonged entirely to me. Harvard wasn't a whim. It was the plan I'd been building since I was 14 years old, poring over admissions statistics in the school library, mapping out exactly which extracurriculars, which recommendation letters, which application essays would make the difference between a rejection and an acceptance. I applied early action in the fall of my senior year, and in December I got the email that changed the shape of my entire future. Not an outright acceptance, but an invitation for a final in-person interview with the regional admissions director, the last step before a decision. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early January, a flight out of Nashville at 7:15 a.m., landing in Boston with just enough time to get to the interview site by early afternoon. I'd saved for that flight myself, working weekend shifts at a bookstore since sophomore year, refusing to let my parents' indifference be the reason I missed my shot. I printed my boarding pass 3 days early and kept it tucked inside my planner like it was something sacred, something that might get taken from me if I left it lying around in the open. What I didn't know yet was that my mother had already made other plans for that exact morning. Plans that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that Paisley had been begging for weeks for a mother-daughter spa day before her big cheer competition. And that in my family's arithmetic, my one irreversible shot at the future I'd spent 4 years building was about to be weighed against a facial and a mani-pedi, and lose. I had no idea, sitting in my room that January morning with my bag already packed and my boarding pass in hand, that the fight waiting for me downstairs wasn't going to be a fight at all. It was going to be a decision my parents had already made without me, one they fully expected me to simply accept, the same way I always had. If you've ever had your future treated as negotiable while someone else's convenience was treated as sacred, drop the word duties in the comments. I read every single one. And stay with me because what happened next in that driveway is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. To understand how deep this went, you have to understand the accounting nobody in my house ever did out loud, the invisible ledger where my time was always worth less than Paisley's comfort. By the time I hit high school, the pattern had calcified into something so routine nobody even questioned it anymore. I was the responsible one, which in Ashby family language meant my plans were the ones that could always be rearranged. Paisley was the delicate one, which meant her wants were treated with the urgency other families reserve for medical emergencies. I remember being 14 and missing my own middle school honors ceremony because my mother needed me to stay home and help Paisley rehearse a cheer routine for a competition that, in the end, her squad didn't even place in. I remember being 15 and giving up a weekend debate camp deposit, one I'd saved for myself, because my father decided the money would be better spent on a private tumbling coach for Paisley instead, someone he hired without ever mentioning it to me until the withdrawal already showed up in the family account. None of these moments were catastrophic on their own. That's the part people outside a family like mine never quite understand. There's no single incident you can point to and say that's the neglect. It's cumulative. It's 1,000 small decisions cast in the same direction over and over, until the outcome becomes inevitable and nobody has to say it out loud. Paisley's world came first and mine got assembled out of whatever was left over. My mother had a phrase she loved. "We're just trying to keep the peace, Corinne. You're so much more mature than your sister, you understand these things." She said it like a compliment every single time, like maturity was a gift instead of a punishment disguised as praise. What she really meant was, you don't complain, so we're going to keep exploiting that. Paisley complained about everything and every complaint got treated like a 5-alarm fire. I complained about nothing and my silence got treated as confirmation that nothing was actually wrong. My father's version was quieter but somehow sharper. He was a numbers man, precise about business deals, vague and evasive about anything involving his daughter's emotional lives. When I brought home a perfect ACT score, he said, "That's terrific, sweetheart," and then spent the rest of dinner explaining to my mother why Paisley's B- in algebra wasn't really her fault, blaming the teacher, the curriculum, anything except an honest look at effort. I got into a rhythm of managing my own expectations downward so the disappointment would sting less. I stopped announcing good news at the dinner table because announcing it into a room that didn't care felt worse than not saying anything at all. When I made the National Honor Society, I told my parents over text, 3 days after the fact, almost as an afterthought because some part of me had already learned not to expect a reaction that matched the size of the accomplishment. Paisley, for her part, never had to do any of that math. Her world was engineered so that wanting something and receiving it were nearly the same motion. When she wanted a car for her 16th birthday, she got a car, a nicer one than the used sedan I'd been handed 2 years earlier as a hand-me-down. When she wanted to quit piano after 8 months because it was boring, nobody pushed back. When she wanted new cheer shoes mid-season because the old ones didn't feel right anymore, my mother drove to the mall that same afternoon. I applied to Harvard entirely on my own. Filled out every form, wrote every essay draft, arranged every recommendation letter myself, because asking my parents for help felt like asking for something they'd never actually offer, and I'd rather not experience the disappointment of the question going unanswered. When my early action results came back as an invitation to interview rather than an outright rejection, I read the email 3 times alone in my room before I told anyone, because I'd learned by 17 not to bring big news into a room until I was sure I could survive the silence that might follow it. When I finally told my parents, my father said, "That's great, that's a good school," in the same tone he might use to acknowledge a decent weather forecast, then immediately pivoted to asking whether I'd remembered to pick up Paisley's dry cleaning for the competition next weekend. My mother hugged me, which I'll give her credit for, but even that hug felt transactional, like she was checking a box marked supportive parent before turning her attention back to the conversation that actually held her interest. I spent the next month preparing for that interview like it was the only thing standing between me and the rest of my life, because in a very real sense, it was. I researched the admissions director. I practiced answers out loud in my bathroom mirror until the words stopped sounding rehearsed. I picked out my outfit 2 weeks in advance. A charcoal blazer I'd bought with bookstore money, the only formal thing I owned that didn't look like it belonged to someone else's idea of me. I had no idea that the morning of my flight, my parents were going to treat the single most important day of my life as an inconvenience to be negotiated around Paisley's schedule instead of the other way around, the same way they'd treated every other important day I'd ever had. The spa day had been on the calendar for exactly 9 days by the time my interview morning arrived, which meant my mother had booked it 4 days after I'd already told her, in plain, unambiguous language, that my Harvard interview flight was scheduled for that exact Tuesday. I'd shown her the confirmation email myself on my phone in the kitchen, watching her eyes move across the screen. She'd nodded, said, "Okay, noted," and then apparently gone right ahead and booked Paisley a full day at El Bell Spa and Wellness anyway, the same Tuesday, an hour's drive from the airport in the opposite direction of my flight. I found out the collision existed 4 days before my flight on a Friday night, when Paisley came bouncing into my room holding her phone like a trophy. "Guess what? Mom's taking me to get a facial and mani-pedi Tuesday before the competition. It's going to be so relaxing." I remember the exact sensation of my stomach dropping because Tuesday was my flight day and I already knew with a sick, familiar certainty exactly how this was going to unfold before anyone had even said a word about logistics. "Paisley, that's the day I fly out for my Harvard interview," I said. "Mom knows that. I told her weeks ago." She shrugged, still scrolling her phone. "I mean, I don't know what to tell you. The appointment's already booked." Mom said it's fine. It was not, in fact, fine, and I found that out for certain the next morning, Saturday, when I brought it up directly with my mother over breakfast. "Mom, the spa day is the same day as my flight. I need someone to drive me to the airport that morning. Can we move the appointment?" She didn't even look up from her coffee. "El Bell books out weeks in advance, Corinne. We can't just move it. Can't you take a later flight?" "There's no later flight that gets me there in time for the interview. It's a 7:15 departure. That's the flight." "Well," she said in that particular tone that meant she'd already stopped listening, "we'll figure something out." We did not figure something out. What actually happened over the following 3 days was a slow, deliberate erosion of every solution I proposed. I suggested calling a cab to the airport myself, and my mother said that was wasteful when we had 2 perfectly good cars sitting in the driveway. I suggested my father drive me before work, and he said his first client meeting was non-negotiable, the same phrase, I noted, that nobody in that house ever applied to anything of mine. I suggested Paisley simply move her own appointment to the afternoon since the competition wasn't until Saturday, and she said with a flat, bored finality that told me exactly how seriously she'd considered the question, "I don't want to. I already planned my whole day around the morning slot." By Monday night, the day before my flight, nothing had been resolved, and I understood with total clarity that nothing was going to be resolved, because resolving it would have required my parents to treat my need as equal in weight to Paisley's want. and that equation had never once balanced in my favor in 18 years. I confronted my father directly that night in the living room, the way you confront someone when you've run out of patience for polite negotiation. Dad, I need a ride to the airport tomorrow morning. This is the actual interview. This decides whether I get into Harvard. I need you to tell me right now who's driving me. He set down the remote, and for a second I actually thought he was going to say something that mattered. Instead he said, "Look, Corinne, I know this is important to you, but your sister's had that spa day booked for over a week now. Your mother already paid the deposit. We can't just cancel on a whim." "It's not a whim, Dad. It's a flight. It has a specific departure time. There's no version of this where both things happen unless someone drives me before the spa appointment. We need the car in the morning for your sister," he said, like that settled it, like the sentence itself was an argument rather than simply a restatement of the problem. "You're resourceful. You'll figure something out. There'll be other flights, other interviews if this doesn't work out." I felt something go cold and very still inside my chest. There is no other interview, Dad. This is the only one. This is the whole thing. My mother walked in from the kitchen at exactly that moment, drying her hands on a dish towel, and delivered the line I have never once managed to forget in 8 years. "Corinne, stop being so dramatic. It's just an interview. Paisley's spa day has been planned for weeks. We need you to understand that not everything can revolve around you. Not everything can revolve around you." I had spent 18 years revolving around everyone else in that house, and the one morning I needed something to revolve around me, even slightly, even for 90 minutes, I was being accused of demanding too much. "This is the same thing you've done my whole life," I said, and my voice cracked on the word life in a way I hated, because I didn't want to sound like I was pleading. "You've never once asked what I needed without weighing it against what Paisley wanted first. And Paisley wins every single time." My father's jaw tightened. "Don't be so dramatic. It's one morning." "It's not one morning. It's the only morning that will ever matter for this specific thing." Nobody had an answer for that. My mother went back to the kitchen. My father picked the remote back up. And I stood there in the middle of that living room, 18 years old, finally understanding with total unclouded clarity exactly where I ranked in my own family's arithmetic. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed running the numbers over and over, the flight time, the drive time, the fact that my parents hadn't offered a single genuine compromise, hadn't asked Paisley if she actually needed the morning slot specifically, hadn't asked anyone anything. They had simply decided the way they always decided and expected me to bend around the decision the way I always had. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at my ceiling, I made a decision of my own, quietly without telling anyone, one that would take effect in exactly 5 hours and that none of them saw coming, because it had never once occurred to any of them that I might finally stop falling in line. At 5:40 a.m. I called a cab with the last $60 I had in my checking account, carried my own bag down the stairs in the dark, and left my house keys on the kitchen counter next to a short note that said only, *taking a cab. Don't wait up. I walked out the front door into the cold January dark, climbed into a stranger's car, and headed for the airport with no idea whether I'd even make my gate in time, and absolutely no idea that the interview waiting for me on the other end of that flight was about to unfold in a way that would connect back to my family in a manner none of us could have possibly predicted that morning. The cab pulled up to Nashville International at 6:22 a.m., 53 minutes before my flight. And I remember running through the terminal in that charcoal blazer, boarding pass clutched in one hand, praying under my breath that security wouldn't have a line. It didn't, not really, and I made my gate with 11 minutes to spare, sweating, breathless, already replaying the fight from the night before on a loop I couldn't shut off. I didn't cry on the plane. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to happen right away in stories like this, and it didn't. What I felt instead was a strange, hollow calm, the specific numbness of having already used up every ounce of emotion the night before and having nothing left to spend. I stared out the window at Tennessee disappearing beneath the clouds and thought, simply, I'm free of this for exactly 6 hours and I intend to use every one of them. I landed in Boston a little after 10 a.m., took the T into the city, and found a coffee shop near Harvard Square where I could sit and steady myself before the interview. My blazer was wrinkled from being crammed into an overhead bin. My eyes were tired. I hadn't eaten anything since the granola bar I'd shoved into my bag at 5:30 that morning. None of it was how I'd imagined walking into this interview. I'd pictured myself calm, polished, rested. Instead I was running on adrenaline and spite, and somehow that turned out to be exactly enough. The interview was scheduled for 1 p.m. with a man named Gregory Halloway, the regional admissions director for the Southeast. I'd read about him in an online forum months earlier. A former high school debate coach who'd moved into admissions work a decade prior and had a reputation for asking questions that had nothing to do with grades and everything to do with character. I arrived at the interview site, a small office suite near the square that Harvard used for regional interviews, at 12:45, 15 minutes early. I sat in the waiting area rehearsing nothing because I'd run out of nervous energy for rehearsal on the flight over. When Gregory called me in, he shook my hand, gestured to a chair and said, "Corinne Ashby. Nice to finally meet you in person." The interview lasted almost 90 minutes, longer than the standard 45 he told me most candidates got. He asked about my research work at Vanderbilt, about a losing debate round I described in detail because I'd learned more from that loss than from any of my wins. He asked what I'd do differently if I could redo the last 4 years of my life, and I told him honestly that I'd have stopped waiting for people at home to notice what I was building a lot sooner than I actually did. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, he asked, "Anything unusual happened today getting here? You look like you've had a morning." I almost lied. I almost gave him the polished non-answer I'd have given anyone else. Instead, exhausted enough to stop performing, I told him the truth in about 4 sentences, that my parents had booked a spa day for my sister on the same morning as my flight, that nobody would drive me to the airport, that I'd taken a cab with the last $60 in my account rather than miss the one interview that might change my life. He didn't say much in response, just nodded slowly and wrote something down, and I left that office with absolutely no idea whether I'd helped or hurt myself by being that honest. I flew home that evening on a red-eye, landing back in Nashville a little after midnight, and let myself into a house that was completely dark and silent. Nobody had waited up. Nobody had texted to ask how it went. I climbed into bed and slept for exactly 4 hours before my alarm went off for school the next morning. The weeks that followed were some of the coldest I remember in that house. My mother's voice took on a permanent edge whenever she addressed me directly, the tone reserved for someone who'd committed an unforgivable inconvenience. My father made pointed offhand comments about people who only think about themselves, always delivered sideways, never directly, the particular cowardice of a man who wanted credit for disapproval without the accountability of actually confronting me. Paisley barely spoke to me for a month, not out of guilt I don't think, but simply because I'd stopped being useful to her in the specific ways she was used to, and without that usefulness she didn't seem to know what to do with me at all. I applied myself to the one thing that had never once let me down, which was the work itself. I kept my grades up through the rest of senior year. I kept showing up to debate practice, to the research position at Vanderbilt, to the bookstore shifts that were quietly funding the life I was already planning to build somewhere far away from Brentwood. Marcus Whitfield turned out to be exactly the kind of interviewer you hope for and almost never get. Direct, unpretentious, clearly more interested in how I thought through problems than in how polished my answers sounded. He walked me through a case study about a fictional supply chain bottleneck at a distribution hub, watched me work through the logic out loud, asked good follow-up questions, pushed back twice just to see how I'd hold my ground. 90 minutes turned into nearly 2 hours. At the end he shook my hand and said, "I'll be honest, you were sharper under pressure than most candidates twice your age. We'll be in touch by the end of the week." I made it back to my car before I let myself cry. Not from sadness. From something closer to relief, the strange, disorienting relief of having done the one thing I'd never allowed myself to do. Choose myself fully with no hedge, no compromise, no last-minute cave. Then I turned my phone back on and the relief didn't last long. 14 missed calls now. Voicemails stacked up like evidence at a trial. I sat in that parking lot and listened to all of them in order because some masochistic part of me needed to hear exactly how bad it was before I drove home to face it in person. My mother's first voicemail, timestamped 7:15 a.m., was confused more than angry. "Delaney, honey, where are you? We need you to help get Colton ready. Call me back." The second, 7:40 sharper. "Delaney, this isn't funny. Your brother needs you here. Call me the second you get this." By the fourth voicemail, 8:20 a.m., her voice had shifted into something colder, more clipped. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is incredibly selfish, even for you. Even for you." I sat with that phrase for a long time. My father's voicemails were shorter, angrier, more direct. The last one, left at 9:05 a.m. while I was presumably somewhere in the middle of my case study exercise, said only, "Delaney, call me back. No. This is unacceptable." I found out later, piece by piece, what had actually happened at Grantsville that morning. Colton had shown up without me there to help him get calm, which apparently meant he'd spent the pre-game warm-up unusually anxious, snapped at a teammate during drills, and then played what his own coach later described as one of his worst halves of the season. 2 careless turnovers, a yellow card for a reckless tackle born out of frustration, and a missed shot from 6 yards out that he sailed over the crossbar in a moment that, according to my mother, could have changed everything if the scouts in attendance had seen a different version of him. I don't say this to be cruel about my brother. I say it because it matters to what happened later. Colton wasn't a bad athlete. He was, by every account, a genuinely talented one. But my family had spent years building an entire mythology around the idea that his success depended on constant management, that he needed his sister there smoothing his emotional edges before he could function, that without that scaffolding he'd crumble. And on the one morning that scaffolding wasn't there, instead of anyone stopping to ask why an 18-year-old required that level of hand-holding before a soccer match, they simply blamed me for removing it. I drove home from Columbus that afternoon already knowing exactly what was waiting for me. I pulled into the driveway around 3:30 and sat in the car for a full 5 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The kitchen was silent when I walked in, the particular loaded silence of a house that has been arguing about you all day without you present to defend yourself. My mother was at the table, arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed. My father stood by the sink, jaw set. Colton wasn't home yet, still at the field or maybe avoiding the house entirely, I never found out which. "How was your little interview?" my mother asked, and the word little did more damage than anything else she said that day. "It went well," I said. "I think I have a real shot at the job." "Good for you," my father said in a tone that made it clear it was not, in fact, good for anyone as far as he was concerned. "Must feel nice doing whatever you want whenever you want without thinking about anyone but yourself." "I have spent my entire life thinking about everyone but myself," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. This was one morning out of years where I finally didn't. My mother's eyes filled with tears, the kind of tears that were less about grief and more about control slipping through her fingers. "Your brother needed you today and you weren't there. Do you understand what that game meant? Do you understand what you might have cost him?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Do you understand what almost missing this interview would have cost me?" Nobody had an answer for that. Nobody ever had an answer for that because in 23 years, it had never once been a question anyone in that house thought to ask. I didn't get an apology that day. I didn't get one that week or that month or really ever, not a real one. What I got instead was a slow, cold freeze. A household that treated me like I'd committed a betrayal simply by existing outside the role they'd assigned me. Colton barely spoke to me for weeks. My mother's voice took on a permanent edge whenever she addressed me directly. My father started making comments, offhand but pointed, about people who only think about themselves. Kept my head down. I didn't argue anymore because arguing had never once worked. I went back to my retail shifts, kept checking my email obsessively, and waited to hear back from Halloran, half convinced that even the one thing I'd finally done for myself, was somehow going to slip away too, the way everything good in my life seemed to when it came into contact with that house. I didn't argue with my parents anymore because arguing had never once worked, not really, and I'd finally accepted that no version of the conversation was going to produce the accountability I wanted. I just kept my head down and waited. The acceptance letter came in mid-March, a thick envelope that felt different in my hands than any other mail I'd ever received. I read it alone in my room 3 times before I told anyone, the same instinct that had made me hide my interview invitation months earlier, because some part of me had learned over 18 years, not to bring big news into a room until I could survive the silence that might follow it. When I finally told my parents at dinner, my father set down his fork and said, "Harvard." Actually Harvard, in a tone that had more disbelief in it than pride, as though the outcome itself was the surprising part rather than anything he'd witnessed me build toward for 4 straight years. My mother said, "Well, that's wonderful, Corinne," and then within the same breath, pivoted to asking whether I'd remembered that Paisley's regional competition was the same weekend as my graduation ceremony, and whether we might need to figure out the logistics of attending both. I remember sitting at that table understanding with total finality that nothing about that morning 8 months earlier had taught either of my parents anything. The hierarchy hadn't cracked. It had simply absorbed the outcome and kept running exactly the way it always had. Because in their minds I suppose I'd gotten in despite the spa day, which meant the spa day itself had cost nothing at all. I left for Cambridge that August with 2 suitcases, a modest scholarship, and a determination that had very little left to do with proving anything to the people I was leaving behind. My father drove me to the airport that time, silent for most of the ride, and at the gate he said, almost as an apology though he never used the word, "You've always been the one who figures things out on your own, Corinne. I guess that served you well." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that figuring things out on my own had never been a compliment. It had been a survival mechanism built entirely because nobody had ever offered to figure anything out with me. I just said, "Thanks, Dad," and boarded the plane. College became the first sustained stretch of my life where effort translated directly into recognition instead of disappearing into someone else's narrative. I studied economics, worked 2 campus jobs to cover expenses my scholarship didn't touch, and graduated in 2021 with honors and a job offer already in hand from a management consulting firm in Boston, a role I'd landed entirely through my own networking, my own interview prep, my own 4 years of quietly building something nobody at home had ever bothered to notice. Paisley, meanwhile, never went to college. She talked about it vaguely throughout high school, cosmetology school, maybe a business degree eventually, nothing that ever solidified into an actual plan, because nothing in her life up to that point had ever required her to build a plan on her own. She spent a few years drifting between retail jobs and a short-lived stint managing social media for a friend's boutique that closed within a year. By the time I was 3 years into my consulting career, climbing steadily, building a name for myself in a firm that valued exactly the kind of relentless, self-directed work ethic that Brentwood had never once rewarded in me, Paisley was still living at home, still waiting for a version of adulthood to arrive the same effortless way everything else in her life always had. I had no idea in those early years building my career in Boston, that a decision my firm was about to make regarding a new office expansion into Nashville was going to bring my entire past crashing directly back into my present, in a way that would put my sister's future quite literally into my hands. By 2024, I'd spent 7 years building a career at Holbrook Strategy Partners, a management consulting firm that specialized in operations restructuring for mid-market companies across the Southeast. I'd started as an entry-level analyst straight out of Harvard, made senior consultant by 2021, and in early 2024 at 29 years old, I was promoted to associate director, put in charge of a new regional expansion the firm was launching back in Nashville, my hometown, a decision that felt almost too on the nose to be real when the offer came through. I moved back to Tennessee that spring, not to Brentwood, but to a downtown condo I bought outright with money I'd built entirely on my own, 7 years of salary and bonuses and careful investing, none of it inherited, none of it gifted, none of it owed to anyone. My relationship with my parents by that point had settled into something distant but civil: holiday visits, occasional phone calls, the kind of relationship you maintain out of obligation rather than warmth. I saw Paisley even less. She'd moved out of my parents' house the year before into an apartment my father still quietly subsidized, working, as far as I understood, some administrative role at a local business that never seemed to stick for longer than a year at a time. Part of my mandate in launching the Nashville office was building out an entire operations support team from scratch. Everything from client services coordinators to executive assistants to junior analysts, roughly 30 positions to fill over the first 6 months. I wasn't personally screening every resume, but as the office director, final hiring decisions for anything above entry-level support staff crossed my desk before an offer went out. It was standard procedure. Nothing unusual, the same structure I'd have insisted on at any office I was building from the ground up. I was reviewing a stack of applications for an executive assistant position on a Wednesday afternoon in June, mostly delegating first-round screening to my HR partner, when a name in the finalist pool stopped me cold. Paisley R. Ashby. I stared at it for a long moment before I let myself actually open the file, half convinced it had to be some strange coincidence, a different Paisley Ashby somewhere in a city of 2 million people, though I already knew, with the particular sinking certainty you get when the universe decides to be exactly this on the nose, that it wasn't. The resume loaded and there she was, unmistakable. Paisley Ashby, Brentwood, Tennessee. Phone number I still had memorized from 18 years of shared bathrooms and shared holidays. Work history. A scattering of short administrative roles, a stint managing front desk operations at a dermatology practice, a 9-month run doing scheduling for a real estate office, nothing lasting longer than 14 months, nothing resembling the kind of steady trajectory the role actually required, but a cover letter, polished and confident, describing herself as detail-oriented and thriving under pressure. Language that read to me like it had been lifted wholesale from some online template rather than earned through actual experience. She hadn't listed me as a reference. She hadn't mentioned our family connection anywhere in the application. I was almost certain she didn't know I ran this office at all. Our conversations over the past year had been thin enough holiday small talk mostly, that I'd never once mentioned the specific details of the Nashville expansion I was leading, and I doubted my parents had either, since by that point they'd stopped discussing my career with much detail, the way you stopped describing something you never fully understood how to be proud of. I sat with that application open for a long time before I made a decision, and I want to be honest about the two paths in front of me, because I imagine anyone in this position eventually faces the same fork. I could quietly flag the conflict of interest, recuse myself entirely, hand the file to my HR partner, and let the outcome fall wherever it fell without my fingerprints anywhere near it. Or I could let the process run exactly the way it was designed to run for every other candidate, transparently, honestly, without favor and without sabotage in either direction, and simply be present for it. I chose the second option for the same reason I imagine you'd expect by now. This wasn't about revenge. If revenge had been the goal, the easiest path in the world would have been to quietly reject her file and never say a word to anyone about why. What I actually wanted was something closer to the truth laid bare, the chance to see once and for all, without 18 years of built-in favoritism smoothing her path in advance, whether Paisley could stand on her own merit in a room where nobody was tilting the floor for her. I disclosed the family relationship to HR the way policy required, requested a second evaluator sit in for objectivity, documented every step the same way I would for any compliance-sensitive hire. My HR partner, a sharp woman named Renata Cho, reviewed the disclosure and said, "As long as we've got a second interviewer and it's all on paper, there's no issue. Your call whether you want to stay in the room." I stayed in the room. The first-round phone screen was handled by one of my client services managers. Standard process. Nothing unusual. Paisley made it through, Her interpersonal skills had always been genuinely strong, whatever else was true about her, and a phone screen rewards exactly that kind of easy charm. The file came back to me for scheduling the in-person round, and I made that call myself from my direct line at Holbrook, the same number that would have appeared on any other finalist confirmation email. She picked up on the third ring. "This is Paisley." "Hi, Paisley. This is Corinne Ashby calling from Holbrook Strategy Partners regarding your application for the executive assistant position." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I could hear her processing it in real time, long enough that I knew the exact moment she understood. "Corinne." Her voice went thin. "Wait, you work there? Is this a joke?" "It's not a joke," I said, keeping my voice level, the same professional tone I'd use with any other candidate. "I'd like to schedule you for an in-person interview next Thursday at 10 a.m. Would that work?" The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. I didn't fill it. I didn't soften it. I didn't offer her the exit ramp I might have once, back when smoothing her path was simply what I did automatically without ever being asked. "Yeah," she finally said, quieter now, something unfamiliar creeping into her voice that I hadn't heard from her in years. "Yeah, that works." "Great. I'll send the details over email. I'll see you Thursday, Paisley." I hung up before she could say anything else and sat there in my office for a long moment, looking out over the Nashville skyline from a corner office I'd built entirely on my own, one careful, unglamorous, unassisted decision at a time, while somewhere across the city my sister sat with the exact same disorientation I'd once carried alone in an airport terminal, finally understanding what it felt like to have her future depend on a room where nobody, for the first time in her life, was going to tilt the floor in her favor. Thursday, June 20th, 2024. 9:52 a.m. I sat in the small conference room on the fourth floor of Holbrook's Nashville office, the same building I'd spent the last several months turning from a bare shell of unfurnished space into an actual working office, nerves buzzing in a way I hadn't expected, though not for the reasons anyone might assume. Beside me sat Marcus Delgado, one of my client services managers, brought in as the required second evaluator. Renata sat in as well, mostly as a formality, a quiet observer there to keep the process clean. I'd prepared exactly the way I would for any finalist. Same structured questions, same scoring rubric, same format we used across every support staff hire that quarter. I wanted no ambiguity later about whether Paisley had received anything other than a fair, ordinary shot. She walked in at 9:58, 2 minutes early, wearing a fitted blazer that looked expensive and new, the kind of outfit purchased specifically for this interview rather than something she already owned. She saw me at the head of the table and stopped for half a second in the doorway, long enough that I could see the exact moment her usual ease faltered. "Corinne," she said, then catching herself, "Sorry, Ms. Ashby. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to." "Corinne's fine in here," I said, gesturing to the chair across from us. "This is Marcus, one of our client services managers, and Renata from HR is observing today. We'll go through your background, then a short case exercise. About an hour total." She sat. She smoothed her skirt. I watched her try to find her footing in a room where, for the first time in her entire life, none of the usual scaffolding existed, no parent smoothing the path in advance, no older sister quietly managing details so she could simply show up and be charming, nobody in the room whose job it was to make things easy for her. Marcus opened with standard background questions, and Paisley answered fluently enough, her natural charm doing a lot of heavy lifting, though the substance underneath it was thin. The dermatology office job she described as running the whole front operation turned out, under a follow-up question, to mean answering phones and scheduling appointments for 11 months before she left. The real estate scheduling role she framed as basically office management collapsed similarly once Marcus asked what system she'd actually implemented, and she admitted, a little defensively, that she'd mostly just used whatever software was already in place when she started. When it came to the case exercise, A short scenario requiring her to prioritize 4 competing scheduling conflicts for a fictional executive. Paisley struggled visibly. She wasn't unintelligent. She grasped the basic shape of the problem quickly enough. But where the role demanded someone comfortable making an independent judgment call and defending it under pushback, her answers kept drifting toward what she thought we wanted to hear rather than a reasoned position she was willing to hold. When Marcus pressed her twice gently on why she'd prioritized one meeting over another, she backed off her original answer both times instead of defending it. Near the end, I asked the question we asked every candidate for that role. Tell me about a time you had to handle a setback or mistake at work. What did you learn from it? Paisley was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that caught me off guard with how unguarded it was. Honestly, I think it's this whole interview, if I'm being real. I've never really had to build anything on my own before. Growing up, things kinda just worked out for me. I didn't realize how much I didn't know how to do until right now, sitting here. The room went still for a second. Marcus made a note. I kept my expression neutral, the same composure I'd built over 7 years of professional practice, but something in my chest tightened at hearing her say it out loud, unprompted, in a room designed to evaluate her competence rather than her self-awareness. The closest thing to an honest reckoning I think Paisley had ever spoken aloud in her entire life. What do you think caused that? I asked because the question demanded a follow-up, and because some part of me genuinely wanted to know if she'd ever actually examined it before this exact moment. She hesitated, glancing briefly at me before looking back at Marcus. I always had people around me handling the hard parts. I never really had to figure things out under pressure by myself. I'm realizing that's a real gap. Marcus wrote something down. I already knew more or less what it said, because it matched the same conclusion I'd been forming since the case exercise began. Paisley wasn't performing badly because she lacked intelligence or charm. She was performing exactly the way 18 years of never once being asked to stand on her own would predict. And for the first time she seemed to actually see it, rather than simply feeling its consequences without understanding their source. The interview ended at 11:10. I walked her to the elevator myself, professional, composed, the way I would with any candidate. At the doors she turned to me, and for a second the practiced ease dropped away entirely. Corinne, she stopped, then tried again. Did I completely bomb that? I could have softened it. I could have offered her the reassurance our parents always had, the kind that smooths over hard truths instead of letting someone actually sit with them. I didn't. You didn't bomb it, I said carefully. But I think you already know it wasn't your strongest hour. We'll follow up by the end of the week either way. She nodded, something unreadable moving across her face, and stepped into the elevator without another word. Marcus and I debriefed that afternoon in my office. His scoring came in at a 5.5 out of 10, below the threshold of 7 we required for an offer at that level. Not a disastrous score, but a clear miss for the executive assistant role specifically. Renata pulled the file for final review, and per policy, since I was a disclosed family relation, the ultimate hiring decision required sign-off from someone above me, in this case our National Operations VP, a woman named Patricia Souza, based out of the Atlanta office. I sent Patricia the full file that evening, my disclosure memo, Marcus's independent scoring, Renata's compliance notes, and a short, neutral summary of my own observations from the room. I didn't advocate for Paisley. I didn't advocate against her. I laid out exactly what had happened and let the numbers speak for themselves. Patricia called me the next morning. A 5.5 puts her below cutoff for executive assistant, she said, but there's an opening on the client intake side, receptionist and scheduling coordinator, less independent judgment required, more structured task work with clear protocols. Given the disclosed relationship, I'd rather offer her that instead of the higher role if you're comfortable with it. Keeps things clean, gives her a real shot at something she can actually succeed in. I agreed. It felt like the honest call, not a gift dressed up as generosity, not a punishment dressed up as fairness, just a placement based on what the interview had actually revealed, adjusted into a role she could reasonably handle without requiring the independent judgment she'd clearly never had a chance to develop. Renata called Paisley that Friday with the offer. Receptionist and scheduling coordinator, entry-level, $31,000 a year, reporting to our office manager 2 levels below my position, though still undeniably within the office I'd built and directed, on an org chart where my name sat at the top of a structure she was now, however modestly, a part of. She accepted. She started 2 weeks later. I found out through my mother in a phone call that Sunday that when Paisley had told our parents about the job, my mother's first question hadn't been about the role itself, but about the fact that I ran the whole office. "Wait, so you work for Corinne now? Like she's actually your boss's boss?" And according to Paisley, there'd been a long pause on the line after she confirmed it, before my mother finally said, quietly in a tone that carried none of its usual certainty, "I don't know how I feel about that." I understand exactly how I feel about it. It's the same feeling I've carried since that January morning 8 years earlier in a driveway in Brentwood, when 2 parents decided their older daughter's future was negotiable and their younger daughter's spa day wasn't, and never once stopped to consider what that decision might eventually cost either one of their daughters. Paisley has been at Holbrook for about 7 months now. I see her occasionally in the hallway between meetings. My office and the front reception desk exist in the same building, entirely different worlds inside it. We nod. Sometimes we talk for a minute about nothing important, a scheduling mix-up, a client running late, the kind of small talk 2 people manage when there's too much unresolved history to say anything real between elevator doors. Her manager tells me she's steady on routine tasks, still visibly uncomfortable whenever something requires her to make a judgment call without checking with someone first. She's not thriving. She's not failing either. She's exactly where her actual ability placed her for the first time in her life, without anyone tilting the floor to make the landing softer. I didn't do this to punish her. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story as a straightforward revenge arc, and it isn't quite that simple. Paisley didn't build the system that raised her to expect things to simply work out. Our parents built that system decision by decision, favor by favor, 1 spa day and 1 blocked flight at a time. She grew up inside it the same way I grew up inside the version built for me, and neither of us really chose the shape we were handed. But I also finally refused to keep absorbing the cost of that system so she wouldn't have to feel it. That's the boundary. Not cruelty, just the plain, unremarkable act of letting consequences land where they actually belonged instead of quietly catching them the way I always had. My relationship with my parents has never fully recovered, and I've stopped expecting it to. My mother has brought up that January morning exactly twice in 8 years, both times to insist that I'm still somehow holding on to something that happened a long time ago, as though the years of pattern that preceded it and followed it were a single isolated incident rather than the architecture of my entire childhood. My father has said even less about any of it, which somehow feels like the most honest response he's given me. Silence, because there isn't a version of the story where he comes out looking like anything other than a man who chose his younger daughter's spa day over his older daughter's 1 shot at Harvard. I went to therapy starting in my 2nd year at Holbrook. Once I finally had enough distance and enough financial independence to look at my childhood without flinching. My therapist used a phrase early on that I still carry with me: chronic invisibility. Not the dramatic kind people picture when they hear about difficult families. Not violence, not screaming, just years of consistent, quiet deprioritization, dressed up as practicality, until it became load-bearing in an entire personality. I don't owe my parents access to me just because the neglect never looked like the kind of thing anyone outside the house would have noticed. I built a life that has nothing to do with proving anything to Brentwood. I run an office of 31 people now, growing every quarter. I bought that downtown condo outright on my own name, my own credit, my own 7 years of unglamorous, unassisted effort. I've been seeing someone for the past year. A man named Elias who has never once asked me to shrink myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, and who still doesn't fully understand, no matter how many times I explain it, How a family could stand in a driveway and choose a spa day over their daughter's only shot at the future she'd spent 4 years building. Paisley and I aren't close, but we're not enemies either. 2 weeks ago she asked, unprompted, if I'd look over a training module she was struggling with. No parent relaying the request for her. No charm doing the asking instead of her. I did. I gave her honest, specific feedback, the kind nobody in that house ever gave either of us growing up, and she took it without flinching, which felt in its own small way like the first sign of something different starting to take root. I don't know if my parents will ever understand what that morning cost both of us. Not just the flight, though that mattered plenty, but the entire architecture of 2 lives built on the assumption that one daughter's needs were negotiable and the other's were sacred. I've stopped waiting for that understanding to arrive. Some doors close because someone else shuts them, and some close quietly on their own the moment you finally stop holding them open. If you've ever been the daughter whose future was treated as optional while someone else's convenience was treated as sacred, I hope this story told you something you needed to hear. The tables can turn not through revenge but simply through refusing one ordinary Tuesday at a time to keep disappearing so someone else could stay comfortable. Thanks for listening.